Good evening. We're going to get started in true Episcopal fashion about 5 or 6 minutes late. That's how we roll, and so we're glad that you were able to adapt into that. Thank you for sitting as close to the front as possible. And my job tonight is to welcome you to this place. My name is Jared Weber Johnson. I'm the rector at St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church, where we are here, and where we've been, at least this church has been here since about 1907 and in the neighborhood since 1881. We're really delighted to have all of you here tonight. So welcome to our members from St. John's, welcome to our friends from UTS, welcome to you if you are a colleague or a friend from the wider community who heard about this treasure of a person coming to speak with us tonight and said, you know what, I'm filling my calendar with that tonight. So thank you, whoever you are and however you've come to us this evening. Our evening's program is very simple. We're going to get to enjoy and listen to the Reverend Dr. Gary Dorrien, his wisdom and his learning, and he'll be introduced in a moment. That's not my job. I just want you to know that you're welcome here. If you need it, there are restrooms in the undercroft or in the basement below us. Go through the doors here at the back that you may have walked through. Under the stairs, there's a bathroom on the right-hand side as you leave, and then all the way back on this end of the basement, there's a couple more bathrooms as well. So if you need those this evening, please take advantage of them. We are also broadcasting on our YouTube channel and on Facebook, so if you're joining us via the web, we're glad that you're with us as well. This will be archived for you to go back to and pore over the comments later after this evening. Tonight, to introduce our speaker, we're very delighted to have Dr. Demian Wheeler, who is new to UTS, and we're so excited that you all are but you're here tonight to introduce Dr. Dorrien. I'm inventing facts because I'm a preacher and that's what I do. I apologize. So I'll let you tell the facts from here on out. I will do no more lying. But we know that this is a big weekend for you all at UTS. And so thank you for making this a part of your weekend as you celebrate the beginning of your program and all of the things that go with that. Dr. Demian Wheeler.
Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, where I've been teaching theology and religious studies for 10 years.
Which is new in Minnesota. It's new. There you go. You're on.
We are immensely grateful for the opportunity to co-sponsor this very special event with St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church, the home of two shining United alums, the Reverend Craig Lemming. I hope you're out there somewhere, Craig. And Marjorie Grievous. I hope you're out there somewhere as well. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, my teacher, my mentor, my PhD advisor, and my cherished friend, the Reverend Dr. Gary Dorrien. In 2021, social critic Michael Eric Dyson wrote that Gary Dorrien is the greatest theological ethicist of the 21st century, our most compelling political theologian, and one of the most gifted historians of ideas in the world. And philosopher Cornel West describes him as the greatest Christian ethicist since the legendary Reinhold Niebuhr. Friends, these are no exaggerations. Gary Dorrien, no, they are not exaggerations, I assure you. Gary Dorrien is unequivocally the most brilliant and accomplished scholar I have ever encountered, and we are profoundly honored to have him with us this evening. Dr. Dorrien teaches social ethics, theology, and philosophy of religion as the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Religion at Columbia University. He was previously the Parfait Distinguished Professor at Kalamazoo College, where he taught for 18 years and also served as Dean of Stetson Chapel and Director of the Liberal Arts Colloquium. Professor Dorrien is the author of 24 books, including 2 magisterial trilogies, one on American liberal theology, and the other on the Black social gospel. In addition, he has written more than 300 articles that range across the fields of social ethics, philosophy, theology, political economics, social and political theory, religious history, cultural criticism, and intellectual history. At age 30, he was also ordained in the Episcopal Church. Dr. Dorrien is the recipient of numerous awards and honors. Just a few months ago, he was awarded the Gandhi King Mandela Peace Prize at Morehouse College in Atlanta for, quote, distinguished teaching and magisterial, rigorous, monumental, and definitive scholarship that counter and disrupt white racist theology and ethical inquiry by centering the truths of Black life, Black Christian witness, and the political imagination. Indeed, Dr. Dorrien is a lifelong activist and has been a tireless champion of racial justice and democratic socialism. Dr. Dorrien's talk tonight will focus on his two most recent publications, Anglican Identities, which offers a comprehensive historical examination of Anglicanism and argues that its religious vision is directly antithetical to its entanglement with colonialism and white supremacy, and his beautiful and long-awaited memoir, Over from Union Road, which is the remarkable story of how a painfully shy athlete from rural Michigan became Gary Dorrien. Friends, please join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Gary Dorrien.
Thank you, Damian, for that loving and kind introduction. Good evening, friends. It's just a great delight for me to be with you this evening on the eve of my dear friend Damian's big day at United Seminary. I am here, as you gather, for Damian's installation, and I have a lot to say about Damian, but that's tomorrow. Meanwhile, I'm deeply grateful to United President Molly Johnson and Episcopal Dean Jared Weber Johnson for arranging tonight's event. I walked in here and was just utterly blown away to see my beloved former colleague, Barbara Lundblad, one of the great preachers of our time, joining us here, and one of the great feminist theologians of our time, Rita Nakashima Brock, sitting right next to her. Oh my goodness. I am an Episcopal cleric who, as you just heard, has a big new book out there titled Anglican Identities, Logos, Idealism, Imperial Whiteness, Commonweal Ecumenism. I did briefly consider spinning a thread from it tonight, and that introduction you just heard at the end was thinking that's what I was going to do. But it occurred to me a week or so ago that this book is just too theological, sprawling, and maybe academic for tonight, and it might even be too Anglican, since I wasn't sure who would be here. So I'm going to go just totally personal, with an Anglican spin at the end. This is going to be a sliver from this memoir you just heard about that's coming out next month. The title is Over from Union Road. And the title of the talk, not the book, is Alma, Sing of Alma Mater, What I Learned in College. I'm only ever going to give this talk once, so for better or worse, folks, it landed on you. I grew up on a dirt road in semi-rural Bay County, Michigan. Union Road consisted of shacks, trailers, and empty lots. And nearby Flagell Road had working-class homes. My parents had come from poor families in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where my father was shamed for having a Native American mother. He was taunted as a half-breed, and it scarred him for life. I spent much of my youth in the backyard by myself, racking up imaginary strikeouts and touchdowns, but also pondered that God is said to be everywhere, that Jesus was hideously executed on a cross, and that I could not catch the I in saying, I am myself. If God is everywhere, then God must not be a discrete something out there somewhere. I yearn to relate to something beyond Bay County. My parents were nominal Catholics who shook their heads that I couldn't be dragged past either of nearby Midland's Catholic churches. Midland is the home of the Dow Chemical Company. I was caught by the image of the crucified Jesus overhanging the altar. What kind of religion portrays the God figure in tortured suffering and death on a cross? The crucifix struck me as inexplicably strange, repelling, fixating. It broke through to me like nothing else. While I implored my parents to move to Midland so I could play quarterback for the Midland Chemics. Bay County schools went down to half days, and my parents, praised be to God, moved just inside the city limit of Midland. In basketball, I had to play the point because I was too small to be a two-guard, which is the only concession of its kind that I ever made. In football, I struggled to see over the line players as a quarterback, so I ran a lot of rollouts and bootlegs. In baseball, I had a viable shot at the major leagues, like several guys I played with. Midland was a sports factory. The teachers did not like me because I was an alienated kid who read books assiduously but never a school book, and who seemed incapable, utterly incapable of paying attention to them. I just thought school is for girls. Only girls are good at it. They even seem to like it. I hated the endless days at school. The one thing that caught my attention in school days was the heyday phase of the civil rights movement. What was this spectacle of demonstrations and preaching and police violence? I ransacked the school and public libraries for books that explained how the protests began, why children had marched in Birmingham, and who was Martin Luther King Jr. In the 9th grade, I read what became a touchstone book for me, L.D. Reddick's insider biography of King, Crusader Without Violence. It described King's upbringing in Atlanta, his studies at Morehouse College, Crozier Theological Seminary, and Boston University School of Theology, and his leadership of the Montgomery movement. I read that book 3 times that year, and King's own book, Stride Toward Freedom. His chapter on what he studied at college and seminary sailed miles above my head. A parade, especially in one fateful chapter, on Walter Rauschenbusch, Mohandas Gandhi, Karl Marx, what's he doing in here? Friedrich Nietzsche, Reinhold Niebuhr, and a bunch of personalist philosophers and theologians. This book planted the seeds of who I became. My head filled up with arguments by thinkers who never came up in the 9th grade and whose names I mispronounced. The USA incinerated Vietnam with napalm made by Dow, turning entire villages into lakes of fire. Dr. King came out against the war in 1967, and a year later, he was cut down in Memphis. His assassination staggered me and worked on me. I knew stretches of the Reddick biography by heart. King was my lodestar of a meaningful life, the key to whatever meaning there might be beyond mid-Michigan. Then he became a Jesus figure who died for us. The crucifix story and the Martin Luther King story just folded together in my mind and feeling. That was the crux of whatever theology I held at the end of my high school years. All these years later, it still is. Mine is the generation that entered, like many of you, that entered the college just after the wild, exotic, traumatizing 1960s ran out. I ended up at Alma College in mid-Michigan because my baseball coach had played for Alma and he looked out for me. I would never have made it into any college without sports. And I was brutally depressed for my entire 4 years at Alma, a bumpkin jock who never told anyone he was deeply hurting. I was so depressed that I didn't even bother with rehabilitation after I hurt my arm. Who cares? In the memoir, of course, I have to talk about this a little bit, but tonight I'm going to sail right past it, except to mark the crucial thing. What saved me in college was the life of the mind that lifted me above the sense plane of my despair, and the prospect of a career in social justice activism. We had no scholar stars at Alma College, but we had many teaching stars. Wesley Dykstra and Roger Haverfield in philosophy, David Lemon in sociology, Louis Thaler in physics, and Joe Walzer and Ronald Masonary in religious studies were my mainstays. Dykstra took us on a fabulous tour of the history of Western philosophy, as described by W.T. Jones. Jones ran through ancient Greek philosophy and lingered over Plato and Aristotle, all of which was just fascinating to me. We plunged into the Christian world of Volume 2, much of it much more unsettling to me. Did too much Platonism seep into Christianity? If a Christian doctrine comes off as bad philosophy, does that refute Christianity? I filled the margins of Volume 2 with reasonings marked Dorrien's view. I know nothing, but somehow I have a view. Defending my improvised Christian worldview from W.T. Jones. Jones argued that the central problem of modern philosophy is how to understand the reality of value in a world of facts. Dykstra concurred that human beings are distinctly valuing creatures, and that modern philosophy began with the turn to the knowing subject inaugurated by Descartes. I took his second-term course on the problem of value in modern philosophy and got my first dose of Immanuel Kant. A fateful moment, to be sure, for those of you who know something about my books and know how much of Immanuel Kant is in them. Dykstra said that Kant is up there with Plato and Aristotle, the three gods of Western philosophy. We read pieces of Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals and the second critique, the critique of practical reason, where Kant taught that the supreme principle of practical reason is the categorical imperative. One must act only on maxims that deserve to be universalized, asking what everyone should do in a given situation. There was a second version, some ways better, I felt. One must never treat a person as a mere means to an end, period. Kant argued that freedom and the categorical imperative are reciprocally implied in each other, for freedom implies that we are subject to the imperative, and the imperative implies that we must be free. We sorted out different kinds of applications, learning Kant's key concepts, and I noticed that I appeared to be more excited than my classmates to acquire these ideas. As the weeks flew by, however, I learned something else about myself. I have a genealogical bent that needs to know the origins of things. Otherwise, I feel adrift in the stream of wherever I happen to be. And Demian Wheeler has a very pronounced case of the same predisposition. Kant argued in the second critique that practical reason is not as circumscribed as theoretical reason, and thus it holds primacy over it. Practical reason can be pure, proceeding from a priori principles, or empirical, driven by desires or sensible evidence. However, only pure practical reason can rationally determine if we are free, whether God exists, and how we should act. Kant's prior colossal work, The Critique of Pure Reason, established his theory of the faculties of reason. Our philosophy majors advised me not to read it. A badly written nightmare of severe abstraction that was utterly impossible to understand. But I couldn't imagine going further with modern philosophy without studying its foundational work. Kant built his towering stature on it. In the summer preceding my sophomore year, I read it straight through, vowing to keep an open mind and just not stop reading. Some sections were reasonably intelligible, Kant's horrible writing style notwithstanding. But how his transcendental aesthetic, logic, analytic, and dialectic fit together, I had no idea. Kant proposed to solve the mystery of the pure thinking of reason. How do a priori concepts relate to objects? Unlike empirical representations, a priori concepts are not the effects of objects given in experience. But unlike mathematical concepts, a priori concepts do not create their objects in the act of conception. There's nothing in a mathematical concept that is not in its object. In math, we construct a priori axioms because we work with intuitions about lines and triangles and the like. But philosophy is restricted to the analysis of concepts. So, how do a priori concepts correspond to objects? What do we know about anything apart from sense experience? Kant pursued these questions with relentless logical force, making an intricate argument about 12 transcendental categories of understanding and 2 pure forms of sensibility. The categories sort into subcategories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality, and the forms of sensibility, he said, are time and space. I entered my sophomore year with a patchwork of abstract arguments in my head that didn't fit together and which were rather difficult to describe in conversation. Kant said, we cannot prove that freedom is real or even possible. All we can do at the level of pure reason is to recognize the impasse contradiction between the mathematical antinomies of a limited temporal spatial world and the whole consisting of indivisible atoms. The same thing is true of spontaneous causality and the existence of God. Pure reason cannot prove or disprove that the world has a beginning, that any composite thing in it is made up of simple parts, that freedom exists, or that a necessary being exists. On Kant's account, only practical reason can guide us through these quandaries. I wanted to write a thesis for Dijkstra that marked out what I understood thus far. He crushed me by saying no. You're only a sophomore, he said. Once you start on independent work, maybe next year, wouldn't you rather write about Kant's moral religion? No. I respected Kant's argument for moral faith, but surely it was not as important as the position, whatever it was, that he expounded in the first critique. I fixed surely too literally on the metaphysical problem. I was still the Catholic boy who scrawled creation on a picture of the earth. Dijkstra advised me to steer clear of Hegel, so of course I did not. Hegel's name kept coming up constantly, so I plunged into J.B. Bailey's translation of Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind. The textbook said that Hegel developed a closed panlogical system based on Kant's transcendental framework and Aristotle's principle of final causation. The Marxist left Hegelian school said Hegel was an atheist who only played with religion, perhaps in proto-Marxist fashion. These were the dominant interpretive options when I read Hegel in college. But Hegel would not have caught me had I believed that he expounded a closed system or that he only pretended to care about religion. The too literal seriousness that I applied to Kant, I did not apply to Hegel. Hegel raced through epistemology, religious beliefs, stories, smart aleck asides, ethical theory, Greek tragedy, medieval court culture, science, pseudoscience, romanticism, and so much more. Always, he probed for the spirit within his panorama of subjects. The phenomenology was a wild, puzzling, obscure, rollicking monster of a book that hooked me like no other philosophical text I ever read. Much of it was totally incomprehensible. but I enjoyed deciphering chunks of it. More important, I felt the power of Hegel's interpretation of Christianity as a picture story about spirit embracing the suffering of the world and returning to itself. Hegel brilliantly described spirit redeeming the world by desiring, sundering, suffering, reconciling, and coming to know itself. In college, I caught only a glimmer of the Hegel I later wrote about, the one who discovered social subjectivity and who had a lot of problems. But Hegel riveted me for reasons I half comprehended and wanted to understand better. His dialectical idealism lifted me above the plain sense of my despair, much like Platonism had done, except Hegel employed Christian doctrines to color the world religiously. The critique of pure reason and the phenomenology stood together on my desk through my college years. Roger Haverfield tried to dissuade me. He was a young analytical philosopher who loved to tell the story of how Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, and the early Ludwig Wittgenstein saved philosophy by refuting the idealistic doctrine that relations are properties of the nature of things. Russell expanded the range of sentences that can be parsed into logical form. Wittgenstein argued that language presents logical pictures of facts, which are called thoughts. Words are names. Propositions are meaningful only if they can be defined and pictured in the real world. And we must keep silent about all ostensible realities not fitting these conditions. Properly speaking, according to Wittgenstein, ethicists and artists don't even speak language. Roger gave Moore his due as a founder of analytic philosophy. But Russell and Wittgenstein were the heroes of this story, developing systems of logical atomism that sought to create an ideal language for philosophical analysis. Then came the logical positivism of Rudolf Carnap, the Vienna Circle, and A.J. Ayer, which employed formal logic to develop an empiricist account of knowledge. A meaningful statement, they contended, is either analytic or is capable of being verified by experience. Metaphysics, by definition, is meaningless. I pleaded to Roger that it cannot be right to reduce the glorious field of philosophy to language analysis and logic. He countered that the analytic turn gave philosophy its only viable basis and future. Roger seemed prematurely melancholic to me until he then introduced me to his world of all but dissertation anxieties, grumpy thesis advisors, term appointments, and tenure requirements. He could see the writing on the wall, once telling me that philosophers make excellent carpenters. Did you know that? His appointment at Alma ran only as long as my time there. His academic career ended, and its sadness lingered with me for many years. My first acquaintance with the busted dreams that pervade academic life. Dave Lemon was another ABD from Michigan State University. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of sociological theory, teaching me its canon, and dwelt on his favorites, Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, Karl Mannheim. He had entered graduate school with a boyish undergraduate enthusiasm for Weber and was deflated by his mentor's insistence that he master the structural functionalist action theory of Talcott Parsons. Parsons wiped out Dave's enthusiasm for sociology, the academy, and finishing his dissertation. By my junior year at Alma, Dave was by far my closest friend. We hung out together, shot basketball hoops, shared our similar record collections, and talked shop about sociological theory. He confided that he longed to hunt and fish in Upper Michigan, not to teach sociology. He got this far into the academy only because he happened to be good at school. He guided me into the sociology of Karl Marx, and Dave was intrigued that I anticipated a career in solidarity activism and perhaps the ministry, not the academy. He had only considered the academy when it mattered. Now, with regret. Dr. Toller was a teaching legend at Alma who befriended me before I took classes with him. One day he plopped down next to me in the cafeteria, announcing that he sought to determine if Dykstra had perhaps exaggerated about me. Dr. Toller was wonderfully ebullient, with an impish sense of humor and a true academic calling, a born teacher who loved to banter with students like so many teachers at so many liberal arts colleges who found their calling and fortunately got to the right place. He taught that nothing on earth is more wondrous than light, and he grieved for the many students whose fear of mathematics prevented them from accessing his field. Sometimes he told them there was still time for them to overcome it, whereupon they could become better math teachers than the ones they experienced. The iconic teacher at Alma College was Joseph Walzer, a Hebrew Bible scholar who won the teaching award every time he was eligible for it. He was a Presbyterian protege of John Bright. He earned his doctorate at Duke, and he was 6 years into his teaching career at Alma in 1970 and prematurely balding when I got there. Joe gave bravura lectures on the Bible in Alma's largest classrooms, making the biblical stories come alive with historical critical commentary. He used Bernard Anderson's book, Understanding the Old Testament, which recounted biblical history in the sweeping, beautiful, epic narrative fashion that Walzer taught it, which mesmerized generations of Alma students. Walzer was a pastor to many of them, deeply kind and friendly to all. Somebody had to teach world religions, so he did so amiably. It was endearing to watch this master teacher fumble with note cards when he taught about Hinduism and Buddhism. Walzer was Alma College at its best, sometimes doubling in later years as the chaplain or provost, often taking students on his summer archaeology digs in Israel. Ron Masonary was my foremost teacher at Alma, although I took only one course with him. His first day there was also mine. He had grown up Mennonite in Champaign, Illinois, graduated from Goshen College, liberalized at Garrett Evangelical Seminary, and sailed through the doctoral program at Duke in 3 years, graduating in 1969. Walzer introduced him to our introductory class so students could meet the new professor. Masonary unleashed a torrent of intellectual talk about something called Marxist Christian philosophy of hope and something else called death of God theology. These were the two hot trends in theology, he said. German philosopher Ernst Bloch fused Hegel, Marx, and a bit of Christian eschatology to argue that human beings are inherently utopian beings and that society must be liberated from the bondage of capitalist estrangement. According to Masonary, German theologian Jürgen Moltmann wrote the most important theological book of the 1960s, Theology of Hope, by appropriating Bloch. Moltmann argued that the Bible does not hypostatize divine reality above or before the world in the fashion of Hellenized Christianity. The God of the Bible holds together the present and the future. Christianity is inherently eschatological, revolutionizing the future through its kingdom-focused hope. Masonary said this idea of the divine as the power of the future working into the present was the only one that he could accept. The God-is-dead theologians whom he planned to teach, Thomas J.J. Altizer and William Hamilton, were correct in contending that the hypostatized God of classical theism is dead. Oh, goodness. That was a bit harder edge than Dr. Walzer had expected, at least as first-day introduction. He read the room, reaching out to students who were red in the face, assuring them that the religion department was not anti-religious. But he also said, it's a great thing for this college to have a high-powered theologian. And of course, this is a few years before there's even such a thing as feminist theology. It's just not a category yet. Masonry did not aim for Walzer-like legend status at Alma. He was there to provoke students and subvert their provincialism, telling them their mothers were not the greatest cooks in the world. I attached myself to Masonry from the beginning, quizzing him about theology and theologians. He was razor sharp about both. I read all the books that he assigned to his classes. We engaged in weekly shop talk about them, and he teased me that Dykstra and Walzer handled much too gently the papers that I wrote for them, allowing me to prattle about my beliefs and my feelings. I don't care what you believe, and I don't care about your feelings either. I'm here to mess with your head. We developed a ritual. I would hand him a paper, and Ron would say, "I'm going to tear hell out of this one." He was a great thrasher of papers, and he became a treasured friend to me. The only theology class I took there was on major theologians, from Friedrich Schleiermacher to Rudolf Bultmann, in my junior year. But Ron did facilitate 2 independent projects and a thesis with me in my junior and senior years, and for 4 years, he was the great teacher for me. Ron believed that modern theology was expiring. He taught superbly about its glory era, from Schleiermacher to Ernst Troeltsch, commending the old German liberals for grappling creatively with modern disbelief. Schleiermacher launched the modern era of theology by reasoning that all doctrines are attempts to make sense of religious experience. Spiritual feeling is the wellspring of religion. God is the whence of the human experience of dependence and freedom. Troeltsch was the last great figure of the German liberal tradition, calling for a thoroughly historicist theology that does not privilege Christian questions. Ron said the dialectical theologians who overturned the liberal establishment in theology after World War I, Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Emil Brunner, and Rudolf Bultmann, kept theology alive for another half-century by refashioning shards of the old orthodoxies. Now the end of the line had come, which Altizer and Hamilton poignantly described. Perhaps theology could wrangle a future as a post-theistic form of cultural studies and political theology. Ron had a soft spot for Walter Rauschenbusch because of his religious socialism, which reminded me that King discussed Rauschenbusch in Stride Toward Freedom. Maybe there was something in Rauschenbusch worth retrieving. Altizer and Hamilton made me skeptical about delving further into theology. If that's where theology was going, I was inclined to stick with Kant and Hegel. I didn't belong to a church, so there was nothing holding me to theology except Jesus crucified and Martin Luther King. In my sophomore fall term, however, I read Rauschenbusch and James Cone on my own. Rauschenbusch's social gospel classic, Christianity and the Social Crisis, enthralled me. He described the prophetic strain of biblical teaching as a message of radical social transformation. Christianity, he argued, obscured the revolutionary spirit of the gospel, but it's not too late for the church to adopt the way and spirit of Jesus. The church is supposed to be a new kind of community that transforms the world by the power of Christ's kingdom-bringing spirit. The idea of the indwelling and growing commonwealth of God is not merely part of Christianity. It's the central thing holding everything else together. Christianity is a kingdom movement that carries God into everything you do. In a concluding chapter with a Leninist title, What to Do, Rauschenbusch made a scintillating case for democratic socialism. I thought that is what Christianity should sound like. For years, I felt that King laid hold of something that the rest of the church just somehow missed. Rauschenbusch had arguments about what was missing, expressing brilliantly the vision of a liberationist Christianity. The books that I read about the social gospel said it was an idealistic movement that briefly influenced liberal Protestantism before it was discredited by the neo-Orthodox reaction, especially Barth and Reinhold Niebuhr. Reading Rauschenbusch, I could, of course, see various problems. He loved idealistic rhetoric. He said almost nothing about racism, and he was proudly, stridently, vehemently anti-Catholic. Remember, I'm at least nominally Catholic. That's how I grew up. I have a Catholic soul. But for grasping and expressing the prophetic core of the gospel, Rauschenbusch soared above everyone except Martin Luther King. James Cone had recently published his pioneering books, Black Theology and Black Power and A Black Theology of Liberation. I read both of them spellbound over one weekend. Reading Kant and Hegel on my own didn't faze me because I didn't get frustrated when they were incomprehensible. I just kept reading. With Cone, I wanted to understand every blistering sentence, but I knew almost nothing about the black nationalist tradition or Frantz Fanon. I had read James Baldwin and the autobiography of Malcolm X, which were my only clues to what Cone was doing in these books. I needed to talk to somebody about it. Cone's electrifying prose was ringing in my head when the college held an event for students and administrators. I got planted next to the president, radiating awkward shyness. But he was a Presbyterian minister named Robert Swanson who had taught at McCormick Theological Seminary before he came to Alma. I asked if he had read these books by James Cone. Dr. Swanson said he regretted that being a president prevented him from keeping up with theology. I said, you should really make an exception for these books. And he surprised me by saying, well, let's invite this Professor Cone to campus. He sent me to confer with religion professor Tracy Luke, who blessedly taught a course on Black American literature. And a few months later, James Cone himself was speaking at our little college. He rocked our campus with a fusion of his two books, a brief excursus on a song by the Rascals, and a stunning concluding section that was just for us. He talked about slave ships and auction blocks and lynching. He explained that black theology interprets Christianity and the American experience from the perspective of oppressed black Americans. He said very hard things about white liberals, white Christianity, white conceits, and Martin Luther King, describing white Americans as racists who couldn't imagine giving up their white privilege. He lightened the mood for a moment with a song that everybody knew, all the world over, so easy to see, people everywhere just want to be free. Then he held up a copy of our course catalog and ripped it to shreds. We were being taught white theology, he said, and white philosophy, white sociology, white psychology, and white everything else, as though nothing but white thinking had ever counted as thought. And all of it was paraded in the name of universality and the liberal arts. Cone was the founder of the revolutionary turn in theology that interpreted Christian doctrines through a black power conception of blackness. He taught me, even more than Baldwin, to read U.S. American history through the lens of the black American struggle against racism. He employed the term black in a twofold sense, marking the cultural identity of a specific people and a symbol of liberation for all oppressed people, confirming at Alma that the second meaning was important to him. One of the very few women on our faculty, sociologist Irene Linder, very adeptly drew him out on the latter subject. Reading and meeting Cone was the highlight of my sophomore year. Being a loner bumpkin spared me from much of the offended feeling he stirred on campus. I wasn't at the frat parties. He said he came to Alma only to learn if we had any black students, learning that we had 28. Many years later, after he became one of the dear friends of my life, he told me that the thing he most enjoyed in his career was his lecture touring of the early 1970s. The lowlight of my junior year was the 1972 presidential election. Some of you will remember it well, or you will have had a similar experience. U.S. Senator George McGovern won the Democratic nomination as a mildly progressive opponent of the Vietnam War, who rallied the reform forces in the Democratic Party after the catastrophic election of 1968 put Richard Nixon in the White House. I worked hard for McGovern, canvassing in neighborhoods, handing out leaflets at the grocery store, working the campaign telephones, catching bitter flack. It was a harsh experience. People didn't just oppose McGovern in Elma. They hated him for calling America to come home from the war. How in God's name could the Democrats nominate a pinko communist for president? How dare they suck up to those despicable kids who rioted at the 1968 convention? We heard a lot of that. I went door to door by myself until 2 doorstop encounters teetered on the edge of violence, which taught me on the importance of pairing up. I tried to enlist my friend Tom Hill to go with me, who replied, "Why are you wasting your time on McGovern? He's a mere liberal, and he's going to be crushed anyway." This was my first experience in organizing, so I didn't know the answer. I was learning early lessons about politics and myself. My friend Kenny Foster from the Upper Peninsula took the opposite tack. "Gary, you can't change the world. Try to enjoy yourself for a change." That was a non-starter for me. I stuck with the Dems to the bitter end in a campaign that became for me a personal baseline. The place where I established and found out what kind of a political lefty I was and am. A democratic socialist who does not disparage liberals or moderates or ethically sincere conservatives. Bart, Tillich, and Reinhold Niebuhr still loomed over theology, though Bart and Tillich had passed on, and Niebuhr died in 1971. They had written the massive systematic works that framed the field. To study modern theology at that time was to engage their writings. By the time that I finally took a theology course, I had studiously read all 3 of them. Bart and Tillich were democratic socialists who practiced the yes and no approach of dialectical method. Both conceived faith in Pauline terms as a gift of grace, and both despised the German culture Protestantism in which they were trained. But Tillich said Barth's neo-supernaturalism was impossible, a form of pretending. Liberal theology had gone bad by baptizing German nationalism, not because it started with Kant and Schleiermacher engaging modern disbelief. Tillich espoused a post-Kantian form of German idealism, developing a theology of culture disciplined by his many versions of the same dialectic. Heteronomy versus autonomy, sacramentalism versus rationalism, Marxism versus Lutheran pietism, and others, all of which yielded one way or another his synthesis of religious socialism. The Tillich that we inherited in the early 1970s was the systematic theologian who had become spectacularly famous in the 1950s after fleeing Nazi Germany in 1933. I had no inkling in college that Tillich's German political past would soon become very important to me. At the time, it was enough just to plow through his system, which was the crowning achievement of his storied American career. Reinhold Niebuhr's place in this story of inheritance was harder to gauge. He was best known as the theologian of Cold War realism, who achieved icon status in mainline Protestantism and the Democratic Party. Since Niebuhr's long run as the foremost theologian of the Cold War had only recently passed, it overshadowed all other aspects of his career. He had argued in the 1950s that communism is distinctly evil because it's a perverted religion. Unlike fascism, it could not be smashed directly. Communism had to be defeated by a united West with patient, sufficient, persistent counterforce. Niebuhr was a pillar of the liberal mainstream of the Democratic Party, urging the Kennedy and Johnson administrations to defeat communism in Vietnam until 1966, when a despairing Niebuhr called the nation to end its apocalyptic disaster in Vietnam. 5 years later, when Niebuhr died, the USA still had 157,000 troops in Vietnam. All of this was much too current in the classrooms of my college years to read Niebuhr through the historical lens that we applied to Barth. The Barth story was the founding narrative of the 20th century theology, so we historicized Barth. Niebuhr was deeply implicated in our present situation, a symbol of the Democratic Party establishment that created a catastrophe in Vietnam. This was the moment and context in which neoconservatism was born. Neoconservatism was an intellectual political backlash against the anti-war, black power, and feminist movements of the 1960s. I pored over the periodical section of the college library every week, reading the journals in politics, philosophy, sociology, and theology. In the first week of every month, I anticipated with appalled fascination the new issue of Commentary, the tribune of an ascending neoconservative movement. Commentary was not stodgy, waspy, or middlebrow, like most magazines of the political right. It skewered the left with highbrow polemics that conveyed an insider feeling of betrayal. The 1972 presidential election was the movement takeoff, as most of the neocons came from the Max Shachtman wing of the Socialist Party and the Cold War wing of the Democratic Party. They loathed the liberal insurgency in the Democratic Party that nominated McGovern for president. They celebrated Nixon's re-election, even though many of them still called themselves socialists. Two things caught my attention about the rise of the neocons: the conversion story and the Niebuhr angle. Commentary bristled with repudiations of former allies, blasting feminism, the anti-war movement, black power, secular liberals, liberal Jews, and liberal church leaders just ferociously. It did not say that some feminists went too far. It said that all feminists were pathetic and ridiculous. Commentary editor Norman Podhoretz wrote snarky polemics, condemning liberals for supporting affirmative action, failing to defend middle-class values, going wobbly on Zionism, and turning anti-communist. The magazine was about demolishing opponents, not dialoguing with them. The fascinating thing was that nearly everybody who wrote for Commentary was a former lefty, or still claimed to be one. The neocons denied that they had changed. They said American liberalism had changed, not them. Calling them conservatives of any kind was insulting, at least at first. Neocon founders Michael Novak, Irving Kristol, Paul Ramsey, Richard John Neuhaus, and Ernest Lefevre hailed Niebuhr as their role model. They recycled his blistering attacks on anti-war idealists of the 1930s and anti-communist pinkos of the 1950s. Their only regret about Niebuhr, they said, was that he ended badly, repenting of urging Johnson to fight the communists in Vietnam. Certainly, the neocons had a basis for claiming some kind of affinity with Niebuhr, and some of them had known him personally. But Niebuhr belonged to the political left throughout his career, first as a social gospel liberal, later as a socialist who ridiculed social gospel liberals, and later as a paragon of the Democratic Party. The neocons who lionized him, by contrast, streamed into the political right. They heaped ridicule on every progressive movement of their time, and they rode into power in the administrations of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. I was pretty far past Alma College before I fathomed how profoundly the neocons misused Niebuhr. Grasping Niebuhr whole was impossible in the early 1970s. It would be like trying to see the Empire State Building from across the street. 20 years later, when I wrote a big book on neoconservatism, I debated neocons who still insisted that they were the true Neborians. In my sophomore year, our vice president for development, Guile Graham, told me the college was seeking to rekindle its relationships with numerous Presbyterian congregations in Michigan. Was I willing to preach at Sunday services representing the college? I wrote a sermon on the role of myth in religion, the Bible, and Christian faith, giving due credit to Tillich. Pure myth, I said, is the history of the gods. Myth is the natural language of religion, and the mythic impulse is essentially unifying. Like all scriptural traditions, the Bible contains ample mythic material, which doesn't mean that these parts should be denigrated or cast aside. We must break open the myths of the Bible to recover the spiritual truths buried in them. In conservative Christian colleges, I would say, you cannot speak this plainly about Christian myth. At Alma College, we study theologians who write honestly about such topics. Theology is not about pretending to believe something unbelievable. Religion is a name for the ways that individuals and communities name and ritualize their ultimate concerns. Faith is the state of being ultimately concerned, a gift of grace. Theology helps us to clarify which concerns deserve to be ultimate. For the 3 years that I preached for Alma College, I updated the illustrations periodically, but the core was usually this page from Tillich. It was a species of cultural apologetics geared to represent the college. Mr. Graham and I were warmly received wherever we went, though occasionally a pastor let on that they were always he, preferred Karl Barth over Paul Tillich. In my senior year, I wrote a thesis on the influence of Martin Heidegger on the foremost Roman Catholic theologian of the 20th century, Karl Rahner. Instead of asking how objects are constituted in our consciousness, we must inquire into the mode of being in which the world constitutes itself. Rahner taught that whoever reaches out for truth and the holy is under the influence of divine grace. This argument was vindicated at Vatican Council II, where Rahner's influence was strong and historic. I carried Rahner in my head as a possible model, the Catholic Schleiermacher, for a remote possibility, a Catholic future. Theologically, I identified totally with Protestants. Schleiermacher, Hegel, Rauschenbusch, Tillich, King, Cohn, Moltmann. Yet in my last 2 years at Alma College, I took my Catholic soul to Mass nearly every morning. My time has nearly run out, and some of you are wondering about what happened to that Anglican ending I was promising. Those of you who are Anglican maybe can see it coming. But I did not join an Episcopal church until the end of my 20s, so I'm having to skip ahead here. I was long past Alma College and 3 seminaries before it happened. I became an Anglican shortly after I met Brenda Biggs at Princeton Theological Seminary. She was a pistol. Irreverent, extroverted, wisecracking, big-hearted, volatile, intense, and opinionated, with a ready laugh, erupting in delight at good jokes and bad ones. Brenda cussed like a sailor. She smoked 3 packs of cigarettes per day. She called out BS instantly, and she had a just radiant ebullience. Unlike me, she belonged to an actual church, the Presbyterian Church, and she was ordained in it. So we got married and moved to Albany, New York for her first call. There, I belatedly looked for an Episcopal church to join, despite lacking any acquaintance whatsoever with Anglicanism. It was not taught in any of those places I went. You kidding? I became an Anglican entirely on the basis of the intellectual and spiritual influence of one person, William Temple, upon me. His magnum opus, Nature, Man, and God, was the lure. It was a synthesis of Logos theology, Hegel, democratic socialism, and Alfred North Whitehead, all things that are precious to me, and it planted a seed. If this guy was an Anglican, I could be an Anglican. We moved to Albany. I threw myself into solidarity organizing, and I learned with dismay that Albany was one of the most reactionary Episcopal dioceses in the entire country. The Episcopal Church was turning progressive, but the Diocese of Albany was vehemently against all of it. For a while, I failed to find a congregation I could join, that I could even go back to a second time. No Episcopal congregation had any involvement whatsoever in social justice activism. My friends in the activist community were all perplexed. Why would you join the Episcopalians when so much of our work operates through liberal Protestant and progressive Catholic congregations? But I had taken the past 10 years to figure out where I belonged. That issue had finally been settled. Then I walked into St. Andrew's Church in Albany. In most of the USA, it would have been a mainstream Episcopal congregation. In Albany, it was a progressive oasis. The rector of St. Andrew's, Bruce Gray, was a dozen years older than me. There were not many theologians on his bookshelves. Bruce was happiest when he hung out with firefighters. He welcomed me, befriended me, supported my application for ordination candidacy, and encouraged me to bring all my activism and intellectualism to St. Andrew's. He asked me to teach a Wednesday night course on modern theology and was delighted when we had to move it to the sanctuary. I introduced my new Episcopalian friends to Tillich, Cohn, Moltmann, Rosemary Roofther, someone I befriended in seminary, and the two Anglicans in my wheelhouse, Temple and John Macquarie. Tillich taught that spirit is the nature of the supreme reality underlying all things. Will and personality are ideally interchangeable terms, and democratic socialism is just a modern name for the Christian belief in a divine moral order. He expounded these themes as an Oxford Fellow and a cleric on his way to a global stage as an ecumenical leader. He conceived the world process as the medium of God's personal action, arguing that to half believe in God is kind of pointless. The world has an immanent reason, a logos. If this principle is impersonal, it's a principle of logical coherence. If it's personal, that means it's purposive and moral, spiritual, and a principle of variation. For personality, whether human or divine, is immersed in the world process at the level of immanent reason. Temple said the early church was paralyzed by its doctrine of substance, so it just missed the crucial point that matter is dead while spirit is irreducibly charged with powers of life. Instead of making a claim about the sameness of substance between Christ and God, the way the early church thought it had to because it read Plato and Aristotle, Christology should operate at a spiritual level, identifying spirit with will. I recoiled at Temple's rationalist tendency to override the world's slaughterhouse of suffering and oppression. I've carried on a long-running debate with him ever since. But otherwise, and especially in that moment, I utterly treasured him. If he was an Anglican, I could ask the Diocese of Albany to consider me as an ordination candidate and just accept the consequences. Bruce had dreadful stories about how bad it could get in the Albany Diocese. He was cushioning me for the letdown. But our bishop was a saintly, high-minded graduate of Brown University and the U.S. Army chaplaincy named Wilbur Hogg. He contended that the rivalry between the evangelical and Anglo-Catholic streams of Anglicanism is baleful for the church. The remedy, he said, is not the liberal inclusiveness of the broad church tradition. It's for the two kinds of orthodoxy within Anglicanism to find common ground in the gospel and the sacraments. He loved to scrap about theology, but he was frustrated that his clerics wouldn't do it, or at least they wouldn't do it with him. He told me so in our first meeting after deciding that he liked me. Nothing in my very public record of solidarity activism in socialist organizations and Latin American solidarity organizing and all the rest of it, none of it put him off. He said he looked forward to arguing with me about feminism and gay sexuality, and he knew all about my organizing work, no problem. I thought I might zoom through the roof. Not in my wildest fantasy did I imagine this meeting going so well. We met many times afterward. He treated our get-togethers as theology bull sessions, and I never held back. The chair of the Commission on Ministry, Father Robert Purcell, similarly befriended me upon assigning himself to me. I was awaiting my first appearance before the commission when he bounded into the hallway, grabbed my hand with both hands, and exclaimed, "Gary, I'm so happy to meet you. Until now, I was the only intellectual in this diocese." Father Purcell and I marched through the canon of Anglican theology, meeting once per month for entire afternoons, beginning with Richard Hooker, of course, lingering over the Caroline Divines, disposing too swiftly of Joseph Butler, and accelerating through the Oxford movement and broad church liberalism. Most of it was new to me, and he loved talking about all of it, except Butler, whose subtle philosophical mind really did not suit him. Father Purcell was a true believer that true Anglicanism is the distinct sacramental ethos of the Church Fathers that the 17th century and Caroline Divines described. Anglicans are united by their pattern of spiritual practices. I pushed back against abstracting and idealized Anglicanism from the history of the Church of England's royal absolutism, racism, and imperialism. Father Purcell admonished me to adhere to the higher things, at least with him, and I risked our friendship by explaining that that was not an option for me. I had come through the door of solidarity activism and was schooled in various strategies of theological whitewash. If I was going to be ordained in this tradition, I had to grapple with the blood on its hands, not take refuge in an idealized claim about the essence of Anglicanism, even though I recognized that this particular version of a kind of essence of argument is one of the better ones that I ever read. 42 years later, I finally have a book out there that sustains this argument for 500 pages. My books are too long, like some of Rita's. It is dedicated to Bishop Hogg, to Father Gray, and to Canon Purcell, the memories of whose goodness and friendship are blessings to me. I had a health crisis a few years ago that threatened a premature ending to my career. It yielded a twilight surge of capstone books on all my subjects, and now even a memoir. To be here in the Twin Cities, celebrating the achievement of my beloved friend, Dorrien, is a distinct blessing for me, and I am deeply grateful to all of you for it. Thank you, friends. We need that brave person who asks an icebreaker something.
If you're very brave, you can come use the microphone.
Well, I just want to offer a quick response, Dr. Dorrien. I am so grateful that you have written this memoir. And I'm so grateful for how you have talked about your teachers You've given your life, obviously, to the care of students, to forming folk to think well, relentlessly engaging ideas. Are there things about your teaching style that you have shaped and reshaped as you've thought about your own process over the years? How have you changed as a teacher?
Of course, I did do ministry. I was in the parish for 5 years before I went to Kalamazoo College to teach. And I did teach full-time there and also ran a liberal arts colloquium program. But I was also the dean of the chapel there. I was the chaplain. And nobody had any, that was... It's probably a good thing that I was the chaplain. That is to say, it's my job anyway, so I can get away with being the way that I am, because there was no way I was ever going to be a teacher anyway, anywhere, in a way that part of me didn't come out. I put off the academic thing itself for so long. I had a teacher at Princeton Seminary who was a beloved teacher to me, and I go long on him in the seminary chapter. His name was James Loader, and he wanted me to do a doctorate with him, and I just said, there's no reason for me to do a doctorate because I'm not going to be an academic. I'm going to be a solidarity organizer. I already am one, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm just here to get educated, not to, fill some utilitarian cause toward some career in the academy. But in the years that I was in Albany, 12 years of, it's already started by then, so we were 9 years in Albany itself. I do think like an organizer. I have that kind of organizer's mentality of, okay, what are we going to do about this? Instead of griping about things, it's what little group can we, no matter how little it ends up being, it's going to be get them together and do something about our situation right here and see how it goes outward. So I brought all that into the classroom right away, and of course Bruce had me teaching at St. Andrews. So I have very little sense of what it actually means to be a church member, because I haven't really grown up in the church. We were just very nominal growing up. And yes, I would catch a ride with, the Sapanskys next door to get to Mass. But that's, you get only just one kind of view of just what it is what kinds of communities, religious communities, churches are. So the first church that I ever actually was in was a member of. I'm the associate pastor there. So I'm just learning what church is while I'm being a pastor to these people. But I did feel that, the organizing I was doing at that same time and the pastorate, that would have been enough for me. It was plenty. It was all that I'd hoped it might be. And those are actually the two. There's a lot of writing out there that talks about, I'm one side or the other, and it's in all these intellectual categories. But for me, really, that was the polarity that took me into all the rest of it. It's the kind of intertwining of being an organizer and being a pastor, being a chaplain. And then I did notice in that time, since I also did some teaching at an ecumenical prep school during that time, that I especially had a heart for people in their coming of age years. That I thought that, wow, chaplaincies, prep school, or then, college chaplaincy, that might be what I'm best suited. So that, I've been holding off on them. I'm surrounded all these years, of course, by people who tell me, are you kidding? Anyone who thinks about Kant and Hegel all the time should be an academic. And you're repressing it for some moralistic reason that's ridiculous. And so I've heard that for years, and yet I didn't feel that way. I was perfectly content in ministry and with all the organizing I was doing. But I did have that experience of realizing that I really do feel called to this, to being able to marshal my own spiritual experience and spiritual care and intellectualism for people who have the questions that they're going to answer for themselves for the rest of their life. So that got me, heading in a place that I hadn't expected. And then it was the experience of the importance of the academy to organizing. Because, so much of organizing is just weeks and weeks and weeks of planning events, where in the end you have some academic, like us, bring us in, we'll give the talk. The real work's been done by organizers for weeks before they bring us in. And there were a number of times, I wasn't planning to say this, but as long as I'm going to tell this story, I might as well tell the truth. A lot of these academics who came in, they treated us in just such a shabby way. They're kind of superiority complex, and no, they won't eat lunch with us, and can't be associated with us, could care less who we are or anything, didn't even know what group this was that invited them there. And it kind of worked on me. One, seeing the importance that the academy actually does have to organizing, but then also seeing how it actually works often. And I had an experience after we'd just been really abused by a speaker who is someone who's still out there, someone writing books, someone I run into every now and then. But my friends were saying, we should have had you give the talk. And that did kind of plant a seed, and when it happened yet again the very next week, I sat there in the front row and thought, I could give a better talk than this right now. And maybe I do need to become an academic. Maybe they're all right. But if I do, I will never treat people the way we are being treated. So I end up in the academy, and but it was the hook to even get to Kalamazoo College is they needed a chaplain. And there was some teaching on this side. And it quickly blew into full-time because, of course, I love teaching and it went well. And yet I am the person who was the product of all those experiences I had before. So I've been that person all along. And I was actually grateful. Once my closest associates at the school, they're all academics, and most of them don't think the way I do. I'm actually grateful that I have this title, and I'm the chaplain. So it's a kind of cover for the way I'm going to be anyway, that I get to approach our students as spiritual beings.
What I love so much about your presence here for these couple of days is your generosity of spirit, that you would honor your student, and that you would celebrate with our seminary the goodness of this new horizon with a new chair. And you have elevated the whole event by your presence.
Thank you, Molly.
Deeply grateful for that. I have one theological question, just a quick one, and then I'll turn to this bright one.
I was hoping there'd be some theology.
Yes. What is the theology of busted academic dreams? How do you think about that?
Oh, goodness. Wow, that is a profound question. That's a wonderful question. I don't know that I've ever thought about it that way. This has been a major thing in my life. I felt it, and I even who I was attracted to, who I intimately befriended at the school, and then just living with it and staying in touch with them. And then all the people I knew in subsequent stops. I always had a kind of a look for those types, because all seminary and university communities, they all have these figures. people like this who got into it because they were so great at school and they loved it, and at some point it was starting not to work, and were broken by it in a way that then you couldn't know them without seeing their brokenness. There is certainly a kind of spirituality of it, and there's certainly applied to another context. As you probably know, once I hit my empty nest years, I hit the road every weekend for many, many years, and I'm in a different church every week, and I thought of myself as having a kind of an encourager ministry. I'm there to kind of buck up pastors, say, I see you, I appreciate what you are doing, thank you, hang in there, we need you. So I was geared to it there as well, the whole issue about burnout in the ministry, and I saw it immediately. I even lived with it. My wife was a fabulous pastor. I mean, 10 times the pastor that I was. So I just sort of modeled myself, by her. So I feel like I've lived with it. I mean, this has been a really important thing to me in my whole ministry, and yet, wow, have I ever thought about it in a kind of field where I'm talking about what it is in terms that are distinctly theological, where whatever the theological perspective I ended up landing on is some kind of key to how I would address this question. And I'm going to say something here that will be you'll see why I'm stalling on this. I am someone for whom many different kind of theological and religious perspectives are plausible, and I respect and see the sincerity, the spiritual conviction, the light, the love that are in a variety of theological perspectives. So I loved theology, and I knew a whole lot of it, and had written a fair amount of it before I even kind of arrived at a kind of my liberal liberation post-Hegelian perspective that I can't explain, but I was well along the way in the work before I even kind of settled on which one is actually the one that most puts together things for me in a way that is just most consonant with all these books I've written. So I've got one out there. It's called In a Post-Hegelian Spirit, which does this. But it's really the only one of that sort. I am someone who wouldn't be a good fit in a lot of theology departments where just the immediate issue is what's your position, and what's the normative gaze by which you look at things and what you defend and so on. I've never been sort of that way. I've always been kind of multi-perspectival in the way that I think theologically. But lo and behold, it's actually prepared me to some degree for the seminary life world that now I've living into and that you are living into, because now we're living into a time in theological education where nobody can just rest with one theological perspective and then just require people to get it and put it down their throats and so on. We've got to be able to.
Well, let's turn to a seminarian for a question.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Ray, and first off, it's just such an honor to have you here, to get to meet you and hear from you, so thank you.
Thank you.
Hearing the kind of political landscape of your memoir, recalling tonight, brought up this question of in another moment today of so much war and genocide and rising white Christian nationalism and fascism, what advice do you have for us also wrestling at this intersection of organizing ministry and theological education?
Thank you. Wow. Well, I think the first thing I'll say about that, and then it'll help me to think about what else I'm going to say while I say this, Just last week, you might be interested to look at it. The Christian Century sponsored a webinar that Aubrey Hendricks and Grace Kim and I did, and we got 2 hours on this subject, and we were all left with lists of things about what we didn't get into, and yet I think it was a discussion that at least got into most of what we felt compelled to say. And it happened even right there among the three of us. I think, actually, maybe I'll just sit with that, kind of what happened there. Because, the reason that it worked, firstly, you have Aubrey with such a strong position, or it's just gospel-based. And there's Jesus and the teaching of Jesus, and it's normed by the first commandment, and then 3 ethical norms that come out of it: mishpat, tzedakah, hesed, right? Justice and righteousness and everlasting love. And anything that isn't squared with that has got nothing to do with the gospel. And so just denying that any kind of nationalism has anything to do with Christianity. And so kind of zealously, in a way that's just so beautiful, just holding fast to that, deeply, profoundly true kind of gospel basis for refusing the question. And so stuff that Grace and I got into, for Aubrey, he just needed to keep saying no. It's just, I don't want to hear Christianity associated with any of this, because no true Christianity is associated with any of that, right? And so it's just so luminously clear. And I said, when Aubrey and I have done a lot of things together over the years, so I knew what was coming from him, and I knew enough, having read The Politics of Jesus at least 6 times, I knew that he and I see the gospel narrative this very same way. We understand, kind of theologically normative terms, we see the gospel the very same way. So far as I'm on what he's talking about, I in fact agree. Except I can't talk about Christian nationalism the way that he does. Because in fact, all manner of forms of Christianity have matched up with different kinds of nationalism, and there are at least 3 major different kinds of nationalism we've got to put in play to be able to talk about this issue intelligibly and so on. So yes, as is often the case when I find myself on a panel, I look down the panel, one to the end to the other, and think, all right, what's my role here? Who do I need to be here? Here, I was the one who talked about all of those kinds of variables. In our context, and I went into all manner of Rauschenbusch and Niebuhr and Karl Barth. My goodness, they all came into it. Eventually, I talked about because we had questions about what's the value of democracy, and should Christians defend democracy, and what good is that, and what's the actual threat of nationalism? I do think it's idolatry. I think the threat of idolatry is just inherent in any of them. So virtually all forms of nationalism are highly suspect at best, and then some just get outright demonic when they are, in fact, just totally idolatrous. And you can find that. That's all up and down in Christian history. It's not just in our moment here, but we are living in just have a brutal case of it here. I found it important to distinguish between the kind of white nationalism that we're dealing with here and what's going on in the political parties in Europe. Obviously there's a tremendous amount of overlap, or the very same thing, that is just this rhetoric of denigration and exclusion and racism against stigmatized people of color in both cases. But in the European context, it's just straightforwardly versions of that kind of racial ethnic nationalism with no apology, with nothing else even to have to deal with. Has nothing to do with revolutionary nationalism in the global South, and has no connection to some kind of civic nationalism such as we have in this country. The fact that we have this civic creed, this national creed, makes it harder for us to even deal with the issues that, at least in Europe, they talk about honestly. about what they feel like, you know, and why they behave the way they do, and why these parties are now pushing for power. But there, meanwhile, in this triangle where we're getting into all this and more, we've got Grace, and who's just written this, you know, wonderful book on, you know, when God became white, and it's a lovely sort of conflation of memoir and history and theology all coming together, and now coming from a personal perspective that isn't what Aubrey and I are going to back and forth on, because she said, you know, I'm an immigrant to this country, and I just don't bring the same kind of experience. I don't have the same cultural associations in my head. That whole liberal Protestant narrative, I just don't even know what it is. So, you know, it's not impinging on me the way it is on you two. But there's a whole, I you know, have experienced this, all of it, all that we're talking about here, I have experienced every day that I've been here, you know, in this country. And indeed, for me, the issue is just, why is there still so much racism? I mean, why? After all of it, after all these years, after Martin Luther King and all of it, there's just so much racism. To have to fight off and fend off and try to be a good person among. And she says, I can only even interrogate that subject as myself, you know. And so someone who's trying to hang on to Christianity, but as who I am, that part, the Christian part is optional. It's a decision I keep making to remain Christian, but meanwhile, there's this me that has to live in this society.
Ray, thank you for posing that, because it obviously elicited an expansive response. I hate to cut this off, but it's 8 o'clock, a little bit after, and we have had such a lovely time learning of your story and your deep engagement in theological heritage. We're just so grateful, and thank you for being with us, Dr. Dorrien.
Thank you, friends.
Time, just a big round of applause for all of you.